After a nail-biting runoff election, Colombians have decided that Abelardo de la Espriella, alias El Tigre, will be Colombia's new president. Although, to say Colombians have decided is a bit of an exaggeration. The country is deeply divided between two radically different alternatives, and El Tigre won only by 200,000 out of 26 million votes. On the one hand, de la Espriella is the perfect example of the new right-wing wave sweeping through Latin America. His role models leave no room for doubt: Trump, Bukele, and Javier Milei. But on the other side was the successor to former President Gustavo Petro, Ivan Cepeda, a former member of the Communist Party. Now, de la Espriella will have to govern a country with half the population against him, with drug-related violence on the rise, and with virtually no representation of his own in the legislature. This wouldn't be a huge problem if it weren't for the fact that Gustavo Petro has left behind a colossal ticking time bomb. The primary deficit, which doesn't even take into account the cost of public debt, is at its highest level in more than 2 decades. Granted, it was worse during the pandemic, but that was a highly exceptional situation that was quickly corrected. Now things are very different. Without radical reform, the deficit will continue to grow simply by inertia. And Colombia is not a rich country that can afford to live with a permanent deficit. According to the government's own estimates, either the deficit must be reduced by 4 percentage points of GDP, or the public finances will collapse. I'll say it again, all of this doesn't even take into account the cost of debt, which has skyrocketed. If we take everything into account, Petro has left behind a deficit that will reach 7.5% by 2027 if no adjustments are made. Meanwhile, inflation is already approaching 6%. The silver lining is that Colombia already underwent a similar adjustment in the 2000s, and neighboring countries like Argentina have managed to turn things around under much worse conditions. The downside is that, in the 2 cases we just mentioned, voters made it very clear that they wanted radical change and were willing to endure hardship during the adjustment period. These days, the situation is very different. Colombia is completely divided between 2 models that couldn't be more different. And if de la Espriella wants to carry out the necessary reforms, he'll have to seek out alliances and support whenever he can find them. But how did the country end up in this situation? Are we really facing a ticking time bomb? And what does El Tigre propose to solve this enormous problem? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today on Visualeconomik. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, I've got some good news for you. Here at Visual Factory, we have created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge. Through the link below and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain in a clear and simple way the most essential investment concepts, what multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better. Since we send each episode of the series by email and every edition is unique, if you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get into the video. Colombia is one of the poorest and countries with the most inequality in all Latin America. Its absolute poverty rate is 3 times higher than Argentina's and twice that of Bolivia's. Only Guatemala and Honduras are clearly worse off, and Nicaragua is more or less the same. Added to this are violence, terrorism, and drug trafficking. Technically, the FARC, a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group, was dismantled in 2017 following a peace agreement. However, shootouts and cocaine trafficking remain the order of the day. What's more, cocaine is experiencing a veritable boom, and the guerrilla groups are becoming increasingly professionalized. They even use drone warfare tactics. And when all of this coincided with the COVID crisis, Colombians said, enough. They took to the streets to demand a radical change in the political model. That change came in 2022 when Gustavo Petro won the election and became the first self-proclaimed leftist president since the founding of the republic. In reality, Colombia has already had governments with a similar agenda, but even so, Petro broke with the norm. What did he impose? Well, you could imagine. higher taxes on the rich, more social programs, raising the minimum wage, peace with the guerrillas. In short, the typical list for the Latin American left. That said, he came up with a proposal that was totally revolutionary for Latin America to phase out oil. And keep in mind, Ecopetrol is Colombia's largest state-owned company, so we're not talking about a small source of revenue. No, he hasn't shut it down, but he said that it should finish work on the wells it's currently drilling, but stop exploring for new ones. What were the results of these policies? Well, apparently, very good. GDP grew. Sure, at a very mediocre rate given Colombia's potential, only 1.6% between 2023 and 2025. But hey, it's something. Besides, GDP isn't the most important thing here. Unemployment has fallen sharply, and poverty is at its lowest level in at least a couple of decades. And so, the prestigious magazine, The Economist, named Colombia the best Latin American economy of 2025, and the 4th best in the world. Quite an achievement for Gustavo Petro. But clearly, if everything were that rosy, we wouldn't be making this video about the ticking time bomb he's left for the next administration. The fact is, there's a very simple explanation for these positive figures: a spending spree. We've already seen that all of this was financed through the budget deficit. In other words, by borrowing. There have only been 2 times in the entire history of the Republic with higher public deficits: during the COVID crisis and during the 1998 crisis. Now, it's normal for the deficit to rise during a severe crisis. It could even be positive for the economy. But Petro's Colombia wasn't going through any crisis. Quite the opposite. What's more, if the new government didn't implement any reforms, the deficit would continue to grow, and by the spring of 2027, it would already be the largest in the country's history. So, no wonder GDP is growing. In 2025, for example, the economy grew more than expected, but that's because growth in government spending doubled that of households. Come on, we've heard this story 1,000 times in Latin America. When the public spending spree begins, the economy grows, there are jobs for everyone, and poverty falls. And keep in mind, poverty doesn't drop due to public aid. That's almost never the main reason. It falls because of all the economic activity generated by this spending. But of course, the money tap eventually gets turned off. It's time to pay off the debt. And surprise, surprise, there's no money left. Then you end up in the same situation as Mexico, Argentina, or in the worst case scenario, Venezuela. The difference is that these countries ruined their oil industry, the crown jewel, by mismanaging it. Petro wants to ruin it, but on purpose. Keep an eye on the elephant in the room. This is the debt maturity profile for 2025. In other words, how much money was due each year. At the end of the year, Colombia had to pay just over 20 billion, and in 2026 and 2027, twice that amount. And now take a look at how this profile changed right before the elections. The debt for 2026 drops by about 15 billion. In exchange, over the following 5 years, it has to pay an extra 90 billion. But in the longer term, it will also have to pay significantly more. How is this possible? Well, there are 2 reasons. We've already seen the first one. In the first half of 2026, Petro's government had such a large deficit that it was forced to borrow a lot of money, specifically $60 billion in just 5 months, another historic record. But that's not even the most significant thing. Central to this whole issue is that Colombia refinanced its short-term debt at interest rates much higher than what it was paying before. This is the exact opposite of what normal countries do. It's like taking out one of those microloans with almost illegal terms just to pay off credit card interest. Mind you, this is nothing new. Colombia isn't exactly known for its ideal management of public debt. Even so, in recent years, things have gotten much worse. Historically, 1 out of every 5 pesos collected in taxes went toward paying interest on the debt. Well, now it's 1 out of every 3 pesos. And if Dela Espriella doesn't implement reforms, soon half of everything Colombia collects will go toward paying off debt, instead of schools, hospitals, or pensions. Let me repeat, just to pay interest. We're not even taking into account the cost of repaying the principal. Do you understand now why we're talking about a ticking time bomb? But be warned, the government knew this perfectly well. Yet, when the central bank warned that all this public spending could only be paid for through either hyperinflation or a default, Gustavo Petro's government didn't take it very well.
Colombia's finance minister resigned from the central bank's board at its March meeting in protest against its rate hike, while Petro labeled the institution fascist, drawing a rebuke from the bank's governor.
At least the central bank's independence is protected by the constitution, so it's doing what it's supposed to do, raising interest rates to combat inflation. Debt is a ticking time bomb, a threat to the future. But the fact is, inflation is already a huge problem. And let's face it, the two are closely related. Like all politicians, Petro blames inflation on the war in in Iran, US tariffs, or whatever scapegoat is most convenient. But according to an official analysis by the central bank, 90% of the rise in prices is due to domestic demand. In other words, to Colombian policies. And we're not talking about a small increase. Inflation has been the main short-term threat to the Colombian economy for several years, but in 2025, things calmed down a bit. However, it was only the calm before a new storm. Since then, it has risen another percentage point. And what's worse, inflation, excluding food and regulated prices, is rising faster than overall inflation. Why is this important? You may have heard of core inflation. Well, this isn't exactly the same thing, but it's very similar. Basically, by removing the most volatile prices, we see what's happening with the most fundamental part of the economy. And this is where the two things we just mentioned come together to form a lethal combination. Since inflation is high, the central bank has to raise interest rates, and that makes issuing more government debt or refinancing existing debt more expensive. But since the government doesn't want to cut public spending or pay off the debt, it pushes the problem into the future. Again, it's like using a credit card to buy something you can't afford, and then taking out a loan to pay the interest. And be careful, because on top of the deficit problem, there are other policies that have also exacerbated the issue. The most talked about has been the 23% increase in the minimum wage, at least for the formal sector. Remember that in Colombia, half of all workers are employed in the informal sector. And do you remember that unemployment was at an all-time low? Well, yes, that's true, but almost all the jobs being created are in the informal sector. What typically happens when the minimum wage rises faster than productivity? It drives the least productive workers out of the formal economy. In fact, the courts blocked this measure because the government failed to explain how it would affect factors such as productivity or inflation. But in the end, it has ended up in a somewhat strange legal limbo. It's still being implemented to see if it's legal or not, but in the meantime, it remains in effect. And to give you an idea of the impact it's had on inflation, right when it was approved, the central bank raised interest rates by 1 point more than expected. But do you know what's most ironic about all this? That in the end, the only thing that has prevented this time bomb from exploding during Petro's administration has been oil. Yes, the very same oil he wanted to eliminate. Hydrocarbons have been a real lifeline for Colombia, and if international prices stay more or less where they are today, by 2027, they'll contribute something like 2% of GDP to the state coffers. That said, all of this is thanks to the fact that oil has become more expensive, because barrel production has fallen by 25% from its peak, and the fields currently being exploited are not being replaced by new ones. Be that as it may, all of this makes it clear what Colombia's ticking time bomb is. The question now is, will El Tigre's new administration be able to defuse it before it explodes? Well, let's see what the plan is.
Among its first proposals is a radical plan to streamline and improve the efficiency of the government. The plan calls for 31.8 trillion pesos in resources derived from government optimization, including payroll cuts, the proper allocation of subsidies to those who truly need them, increased tax collection by the DIN to combat tax evasion, and the sale of unproductive assets.
This case is quite curious. Della Espriello's economic team is proposing a fairly conservative reform, nothing drastic. They want to gradually reduce the deficit without cutting social spending too much. You know, the usual approach of spending more wisely by putting an end to corruption, kickbacks, smuggling, and all that. I mean, in a country like Colombia, there's plenty of room for improvement, but nowhere near enough to raise all the money that's needed. But the thing is, Della Espriello himself, when he gives interviews, sounds just like Javier Milei. He talks about bringing out the chainsaw and slashing everything. He himself has said that 400 billion pesos can be raised with virtually no sacrifice, simply by fighting corruption, shady businesses, smuggling, and tax evasion. Is that a lot or a little? Well, it's 1/5 of GDP. I mean, it's absolute madness. Even if he were to raise that amount over the course of the entire legislative term, it would still be an outrageous sum. So, who should we trust? Obviously, the economic team. What Della Espriello is proposing is simply impossible. That said, some analysts believe that the government actually does want to implement very severe austerity measures, but didn't dare say so out loud with the election so close. So the economic program proposes a mild adjustment, while the president is actually being much more radical. But he claims it will all be paid for without citizens feeling the pinch in their wallets. Well, it's a possibility, but even assuming that's true, can legislation like that pass through Congress without the government having much representation of its own? I'm not sure, but I'd say no. Everything points to the fact that real reform will have to come from the revenue side. And we're not talking about raising taxes, but about boosting economic activity. Colombia has always invested less than the wealthy OECD countries, but over the past decade, the gap has been widening steadily, and it has widened most sharply in recent years. For the worse, of course. Without investment, there is no sustainable long-term economic growth, and growing GDP is the simplest way to pay off debts. Do you know who knew this better than anyone? Gustavo Petro, who proposed expropriating private pension plans to provide that funding to the banks so they could finance more projects. Look, the idea is terrible. If those investments goes wrong, which is most likely, you won't be able to compensate the savers you've expropriated. But at least he made it clear that the lack of investment is a major problem. Maybe this threat of expropriation has something to do with why people are reluctant to invest. The fact is that since 2022, foreign investment has been down 30%, and fixing this should be the government's top priority. But let's be honest, no matter how much foreign investment it attracts, it's impossible to defuse the bomb without implementing many more reforms. Meanwhile, the clock keeps ticking, and the worst part is that this isn't even the only ticking time bomb Colombia is facing. I'm sure this comes as a surprise to many of you, but the birth rate in this country is 1 child per woman, and it keeps falling. If this continues, 100 grandparents will have fewer than 25 grandchildren between them, and a rich country, well, can make do. But in Colombia, this demographic trend could be lethal for its economy, so they'd better not waste any time and get rich as fast as they can. Time is unforgiving. In any case, now that we've gotten this far, it's your turn. Do you think this ticking time bomb is manageable? What strategy will the new government try to implement? Are we looking at the next Javier Milei or the next Macri? You can leave your answers down in the comments. And don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. If you liked this video, hit like, and I'll see you in the next one. And if you want to really understand what's going on in the markets and learn how to manage your money with more confidence, then join the Visual Factory Club. It's completely free, and the link is in the description. All the best. Until next time.